So welcome to our fourth teaching moment. And we made a lot of progress so far in this teaching moment series. Just a little overview of where we've been so that we'll understand better where we're going today in this message. If we take a look at where we've been and where we've been going, we started with that written text idea. We pulled out the storyline of the book. We'll be using that storyline today. We've looked at some of the background information, author, dating, and where we just were was this idea of the interpretive lens. And that's going to become crucial. Remember, there was 4 different options for our interpretive lens, 4 primary lenses that we can read this book through. And where we're going today is really trying to figure out, okay, what is the timeline now of the end times? If we have a storyline, we want to take that storyline and say, where is that storyline placed in history? And how does it show history being unfolded, right? Now we're focusing on the timeline of the end times. We're figuring out the timeline of this book of Revelation. And there are 3 core different approaches. There are 3 core different models for the timeline. And these 3 core different models are completely different from one another. 3 totally different directions. And I've got a slide up here to show you, right? 3 totally different directions you could go in when you're making a timeline of the book of Revelation. And the names of these different directions, don't worry if you don't know what they mean. That's not the important part, but the 3 different names for these different directions is premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. And basically, we're going to work through and figure out exactly in these next couple teaching moments, what are these 3 directions? What are these 3 different models that people would go in to figure out a timeline? And when we're thinking of what we're doing over these next teaching moments, when we're making timelines of the end times, essentially what we're doing is something that theologians and scholars would call eschatology, the study of the end times. So if you were wanting to dig into this more after these next few teaching moments and learn more about this topic, that would be the academic name that you would find information in. It would be eschatology. That's where you'd find these different models and more details about them. So, just how different, I mentioned that these were completely different directions that they're reading the book of Revelation in. Just how different are they? Well, let me give you an example, an illustration of just how differently these 3 timelines of the end times are. So, here's an example for you. These 3 different timelines would see the condition of the world, day by day, what's happening in the world, and where is the world going. Well, they would see 3 radically different directions, right? Postmillennialism would see, day by day, the world is becoming better. Quality of life is increasing. We were getting advances in medicine and technology, and the world is becoming better day by day. That's one timeline. Another one, completely opposite direction. Premillennialism, day by day, the world is getting worse. This is kind of the mindset the world is like, circling the drain. We're going downhill in a hurry, right? Day by day, things are getting worse. The condition of the world is getting worse. Okay, that's 180 difference, different direction. The last one, amillennialism, kind of in the middle. It would say things like, well, day by day, you'll see triumphs in the world, and you'll see failures in the world, and you'll see this battle being played out between good and evil, and there'll be days where there's great success and triumph, and there'll be days of defeat, and days where there's regress and bad times as well. There's a mix of goods and bads. The world's condition goes up one day and down the next and up and down. And so these are 3 radically different conclusions that these 3 different timelines have come to. Just an illustration for you of just how differently these 3 different worldviews see the world. They go in completely different directions, just like those arrows were showing you. So let's ask an important question now. As we go through figuring out our timeline, we've done the written text, we've done the storyline, we've done the background, but really where we've come to before we get to the timeline of the end times is we need to ask ourselves, what lens should we be using? when we're studying the end times. Remember, there was 4 different lenses that we could approach this book through, and depending on which lens we pick, whichever is our primary lens, we will come to one of those radically different conclusions, right? So let's take a look at our interpretive lenses. You heard about this at the last teaching moment. That's why I mentioned, if you go on the church website, we've got the printouts of notes for each one of these. It makes it really easy for you, a 1-page note sheet. That way you don't have to try to scribble down everything. You can remember them. And from the last time, you would remember that we've got these 4 interpretive lenses: preterist, historicist, futurist, idealist. And which lens are we going to pick to read this book and come to a conclusion with a timeline? Well, let's start out with the futurist approach. And I choose the futurist approach because in the United States in particular, this is probably the approach, the lens that we're most familiar with, and is the one that gets a lot of airtime. We hear about this one a lot, so let's start with something we're maybe more familiar with. So the futurist approach, just a little review. You'll remember that that's seeing Revelation as a prophecy predicting the future end of the world. When we approach this book of Revelation, it is telling what's happening in the future. So, with that lens and that mindset, let's take a look at our storyline and start to build from our storyline a timeline. So our basic storyline of Revelation, and you'll notice that no matter which one of these different interpretive lenses you use, they all use the basic same storyline. They're all using this basic same storyline, and remember this section right here, we heard in one of those first messages that section right there is called the tribulation. And there's different ways we could see these events being connected. You can go back and check that out if you want. But basically, we've got our storyline with this section called the tribulation. Now let's try to start forming a timeline. Well, if we start to form a timeline with this futurist approach, one of the things that happens in the book of Revelation is the millennium, right? And that was one that I had as a side trail in our makeup of the storyline. And as we get further along, you'll start to see why I put it in a category of a side trail, because it has a big impact on how we start making these models. But a little foreshadow of what might happen in the future. The millennium is that 1,000-year reign that comes after that tribulation time period. So as we're starting to make a timeline, we are looking at the events of Revelation, and what are we doing? Futurist. All of this is in the future, right? So where would we be in this timeline? Well, we would be over here. That's us currently. We're looking at Revelation and saying future. Sometimes this viewpoint might say the letters of the 7 churches are somewhere in here. I've got us kind of right here at the beginning, right? The majority of this outlook is seeing future right here. This is happening way out there somewhere. Now, us being right here, located right here, if we start to see, okay, how do we orient ourselves on this timeline? How would we say that we're right here in the timeline? Well, we would call that premillennialism, right? We are currently before the millennium. The millennium is something that's happening somewhere in the future. So this approach, this lens, the futurist lens, when it's starting to make a timeline, that timeline is called premillennialism. Maybe you've heard that word before. Now, for a premillennialist perspective on the book of Revelation, for that futurist viewpoint on this book, there is a critically important question that we need to ask when we're building this timeline. It's one of the most important questions with this timeline. All right, you ready for what that question is? When will Jesus return next? AKA, when is the rapture? When is that moment where the church and the faithful believers are called up to meet the Lord in the air? That they leave this earth and go up and meet Jesus? Well, there's 3 different possible times, points in this timeline that we could put that event at, that are the 3 most common times. And maybe this is drawing up pictures in your mind, right, of that movie Left Behind. Well, that movie Left Behind, right, that's a futurist perspective. They're seeing in the future the tribulation is going to happen. And in particular, the church is going to be pulled up in this beginning point. And that is called the pre-tribulation rapture. The church gets pulled up and the faithful believers leave the earth before all that bad stuff happens, before the time of tribulation. So that's like in that movie Left Behind or the books where all of a sudden everybody disappears off the earth, right? And they're like, oh no, what's happening? And then bad stuff starts happening because they get into the tribulation. That's the viewpoint, that's the timeline they're creating when they're reading this book. And that particular timeline is called Premillennialism. And then remember, premillennialism, it's a very important question to ask. When is the rapture? Well, the rapture is pre-trib. So they would, slang terms, if you're really in the know, you would maybe say, I'm a pre-mill, pre-trib, right? That's the slang that might get used. But really what they're saying is, we're right here, and the tribulation happens, the church is removed from the earth before all this bad stuff happens. The church, they leave, and then bad stuff happens. And if you're wondering where this would happen as you're reading through the actual verses of Revelation, oftentimes this event is placed right at the beginning of chapter 4, in the first few verses of chapter 4. So it's more like kind of right here with the Lamb's throne part, but it happens before the tribulation. And I'll read for you where they would see this event happening in the verses. It says in chapter 4, after this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open. So this is John speaking, the author speaking. And the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was the throne in heaven, which someone was sitting on. Right? So that moment where it appears that Jesus is saying, come up here, some would read that as saying, okay, that's talking about John, right? And John goes up and sees the throne room. But this perspective would say, no, that's the moment where there's a big transition that happens in verse 4, or in chapter 4, in those verses, where it's actually the whole church itself is called up at that moment to meet Jesus in heaven and see what's about to unfold. So that's where they're seeing this pre-tribulation rapture. That's how they're building that timeline. Now, there's another place we could potentially put this tribulation rapture. Remember, it's in the middle. So what's it called? MidTrib Rapture. Mid-tribulation rapture. And this point is probably not as common as pre-tribulation and post-tribulation rapture. But this one, the way that they're building this model is they're overlaying some of the chapters of Daniel, right? Some of those chapters in Daniel that talk about how there's going to be this 77s and those numbers and all that stuff. Well, in that chapter of Daniel, it talks about how there's 3.5 years, there's times, and half a time, and they kind of break up the 7 years that they would say this is a 7-year tribulation, and then 3.5 years into that tribulation, times, time, and half a time. So 2 years, year, and half a year. Oh, that's middle, right? 3.5 years in. At the midpoint, that's when the mid-tribulation rapture happens. And so they're taking the book of Daniel and overlaying it over the top of Revelation, and that's how they're getting this significant event happening in the middle of the tribulation. That's how they're reading the book and approaching it. All right, still that futurist perspective. This is all in the future, but a mid-tribulation rapture would possibly have the church going through some of these bad events, right? That becomes significant. That impacts what we're expecting to be happening and what we're preparing for. And this mid-tribulation rapture usually would make a little bit of a distinction oftentimes, where they would make a distinction and say, okay, this first 3.5 years, that's more like judgments of God. And then this second part, this later 3.5 years, that's more the wrath of God. And the church is there on the earth when the earth is facing judgments, right? When the earth is feeling the impacts of the sin that's been around on the earth. But when it comes to the time where there's the wrath of God, well, the church is removed and doesn't face the wrath of God. So that's like those 7 bowls of wrath, right? The church is removed from that point forward, or from that point, that 3.5-year point forward, and wouldn't face that. We wouldn't be around for that, right? We'd be up in heaven with Jesus, kind of watching what's going on. Different perspective. They're seeing different events and placing different emphasis. What about the last model? This post-tribulation rapture. Now, this post-tribulation rapture is also called historical premillennialism. If you go back in time, a long ways back, and you start looking at the early church fathers, like Irenaeus, like that really important guy that we'd heard about a few teaching moments back, and those other guys like Polycarp and those guys, none of those guys, those early church fathers, really believed in a pre-tribulation or a mid-tribulation rapture. That's something that's become way more common in the last 250 years. And we'll talk about in a few teaching moments why that is. But this post-tribulation rapture, that's something that those early church fathers actually talked about. That's a viewpoint that they held, and we can find in the writings. And this post-tribulation rapture, oftentimes the way that it's interpreting the rapture is this idea that the rapture and what it means to be called up to the Lord, they would see key parallels to a chapter like Matthew 25. And in Matthew chapter 25, let me turn there. There we go. In Matthew chapter 25, you'll hear about the parable of the 10 virgins. And in that parable, Jesus has just, in Matthew 24, he's just talked about the end of the age, that Olivet Discourse. He's making allusions to these events that are happening in the future, right, from that perspective. And the very next parable that happens in Matthew 25 is when he says, at that time, right? At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like, and then he explains this parable of the 10 virgins, where the 10 virgins have their olive oil, and they're going to go out and meet their arriving bridegroom, and they stay up and they're waiting for him. They're anticipating the bridegroom, and then what happens? When the bridegroom starts to arrive, they run out. They in particular uses phrases that are very similar to other places in Revelation. You'll notice the phrases where they say, here's the bridegroom, come to meet him, come out to meet him. And so the ladies with the virgins with their lamps, they run out to meet this bridegroom, and then they guide the bridegroom in. They walk beside the bridegroom and go out there with their lamps to meet him and greet him, but they come in with the bridegroom right at that time, that moment. And so this post-tribulation rapture idea, it's really this idea that to be called up to meet the Lord in the air is to be like those ladies in that parable, where we go out and we meet Jesus in the air as he's arriving, but we're not spared from tribulation. The ladies are there through the night. They're through that dark period, and they go out to meet, which essentially would be Jesus, right? We go up to meet Jesus, and then we get to follow him as he triumphantly enters into the world. And as he descends, and we see these key events start to play forward with the millennium and the end of evil, well, we get to go up and follow Jesus in his triumphal procession. Almost as if like when a Roman conqueror comes back from a battle and is claiming the victory, when they're about to enter into the city, people run out to meet them out at the entry point, and they have a parade and follow them into the city, right? That's kind of the mindset and the perspective of what the rapture means from this post-tribulation rapture idea. And so they would place the rapture as happening out here at Jesus' entry with that millennium and that end of evil happening. So again, when will Jesus return next, the rapture? It's an important question for premillennialism because essentially that determines, is the church going to be going through the tribulation or not? The premillennial pre-tribulation idea says, no, we're spared from that. Mid-trib, we'll go through part of it. Post-trib, get ready, right? Get yourself ready because hard times are ahead and we're going through it. So these different perspectives of the tribulation become extremely important because it directly affects what we're expecting. Now, I mentioned to you that the world is getting, from the premillennial perspective, worse, right? Why would that be exactly? Well, let's circle back and look at that timeline. And the world is getting worse because remember where we're at. That's us right there. And what do we have ahead of us? We have the tribulation. And the world itself is going to be, that idea, spiral in the drain, right? It's going to be getting worse. There's bad times ahead. The next thing that happens is the tribulation in our timeline of the future. And we are here. Remember that premillennialism. That's how you can remember that word. When we're trying to build timelines, the thing we need to know is, where are we in that timeline? So we need some sort of context for us. And then we need some sort of landmark, right? When you're trying to navigate around in the middle of the woods, you're trying to find where am I? And a landmark, where am I in reference to the map, right? So here's us, and here's our reference point, the millennium. And each one of these different viewpoints of the end times and the timeline of the end times, they're going to use us, where are we, and where are we according to the landmark, the millennium landmark. That's the way that these different timelines will compare to one another and give us different insights. So there you go. That hopefully was helpful for you to be able to understand, again, that futurist lens of looking at the book of Revelation and how they would construct a timeline from that and the significant questions that they would ask. Now, we have talked about premillennialism. We've looked at that viewpoint, that timeline, and next up, we're going to look at postmillennialism. And prepare yourself, right? Completely different lens, completely different direction. They're going to see the events that are unfolding in a different light. So get yourself ready for that, and I hope you enjoy reading through this book of Revelation.